Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. Ready to untangle a topic that, let's be honest, might make some eyes glaze over. But trust me, this one is worth sticking with because it could save you some serious headaches down the road.
You got that right.
Today, we're diving deep into the IRS appeals process, and I've got to say, the stack of articles, guides, and even some personal notes you've handed us suggests that you're either smack dab in the middle of a tax dispute right now, or you're just the kind of person who likes to be prepared for anything.
Smart. Always a good idea.
Yeah, either way, you've definitely come to the right place.
Yeah, you're in good hands. It's like having that extra insurance policy you hope you never need, you know?
Exactly.
But boy, are you grateful for when you do.
You know what I mean? And we're really talking about any situation where you just think the IRS may have gotten something wrong, like after, one of those exams, or maybe they hit you with a penalty that just seems totally unfair.
Yeah.
Or denied you some kind of relief you were really hoping for. We've even got stuff in here about offers and compromise in retirement plan issues.
The whole gamut.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot to untangle.
It can be a bit overwhelming, yeah. But the good news is the IRS does have a system in place for appeals. And believe it or not, it can actually be pretty straightforward once you understand the basics.
Okay, so basics first, right? Let's break it down. What's the very first thing someone should do if they just find themselves like straight up at odds with the IRS? They get that letter, that dreaded letter,
Right.
and they just disagree with what it's saying.
Before you even think about appealing, talk to the IRS employee handling your case. I know, it can be tempting to go straight to battle stations.
Yeah.
But trust me, clear communication is key here. Make sure you've provided all the documentation they've asked for, explain your side of the story as clearly as possible. You'd be surprised how often issues can be resolved at this stage.
That makes sense. It's like trying to work it out with the store clerk before you demand to speak to the manager.
Yeah, exactly.
But what if you've done all that? You've been super organized, you've explained everything clearly,
Right.
and you just hit a wall.
Well, before launching a full-blown appeal, there's this lesser-known option you might want to consider. It's called the Fast Track Settlement, or FTS.
Fast track settlement.
Yeah.
That sounds a little too good to be true.
It can definitely expedite things. It's like, imagine you're at an impasse with the IRS agent on your case.
Yeah.
But you both agree, hey, we need a fresh perspective. That's where FTS comes in. It brings in a neutral appeals employee who acts as a facilitator, helping both sides reach an agreement.
So it's kind of like mediation, almost.
Exactly. The catch is both you and the IRS have to agree that the issue is, clear-cut, ready for this kind of focused discussion. But here's the good part. Even if FTS doesn't completely resolve the dispute, you still retain all your regular appeal rights. It's not an all-or-nothing situation.
Okay, that is reassuring. It sounds like a good way to at least try to clear the air and see if there's any common ground to be found. But let's say that FTS isn't an option, or it just doesn't fully solve the problem. What happens next? Walk me through those regular appeal rights that you mentioned.
Okay, so this is where it's important to understand the two main types of appeals. We've got the small case request and the formal written protest. Now, if the amount you're disputing is $25,000 or less per tax period,
Okay.
you can go with the small case request. Think of it as the small claims court of the tax world.
So for those relatively minor disagreements, there's a simpler option.
Right.
Makes sense. What does that look like in practice?
You can either submit a concise written statement explaining the issue and why you disagree,
Okay.
or you can use Form 12203, which is the request for appeals review. You don't need to go full-on legal scholar here, just clearly lay out your case.
Got it. So it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But what about the big ticket disputes? The ones where the numbers are making your head spin?
That's where the formal written protest comes in. This is needed for anything over $25,000, and it's also required for certain case types. We're talking employee plans, exempt organizations, partnerships, and S corporations.
Okay, so this is the heavyweight division of tax appeals. What exactly goes into a formal written protest? It sounds pretty intense.
It's all about building a solid case. You'll clearly state your intent to appeal, include your contact info, of course, and then list each disputed item with the tax periods they cover, the IRS's proposed changes, and why you disagree with each one.
And I'm guessing just saying, nope, that's wrong, isn't going to cut it.
Probably not, no. You'll need to back up your position with hard evidence. That could be documentation, calculations, even relevant laws or legal precedents.
So you really got to show your work, so to speak. Is there anything else that tends to trip people up when they're putting this together?
One thing that's often overlooked is what's called the penalties of perjury statement. You'll need to include this along with your signature or your representative's signature, confirming that everything you're presenting is accurate and complete to the best of your knowledge. It adds that layer of seriousness and accountability.
So no fibbing allowed. Got it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you've filed your protest, you've dotted your I's, crossed your T's. What happens next? Do you get, like, hauled into some intimidating IRS courtroom?
Nothing quite as dramatic as that. You'll get the chance to present your case at what's called an appeals conference.
Okay, so what can someone expect at one of these conferences? Is it like, a courtroom drama on TV? All serious and stuffy?
Think of it more as a structured conversation. It's a chance to sit down with an appeals employee in a relatively informal setting and just walk them through your arguments. The key here is to be prepared to discuss each disputed point, have all your evidence organized, and be ready to answer their questions.
So it's your chance to really make your case, face to face to the person who's reviewing your appeal.
Precisely. And here's the good news. You don't have to go through this alone. You have the right to bring representation to the appeals conference.
Oh, good.
That could be an attorney, a CPA, or an enrolled agent.
That's a relief to know. Having, a professional in your corner can make all the difference in these situations, especially if things get complicated.
Absolutely. And if you're worried about the cost of professional representation, there's something called low-income taxpayer clinics, or LITCs.
Okay.
And they provide assistance to those who qualify. Fantastic resource.
All right, so we've got the prep work, the types of appeals, now this appeals conference. Anything else we absolutely need to know about before moving on?
There's this crucial concept called the statute of limitations that plays a big role here. Essentially, the IRS has a limited amount of time to assess additional taxes. It's like a deadline for them.
Wait, so even the IRS has deadlines? That's kind of comforting, actually. Tell me more about this statute thing.
So, generally speaking, the IRS won't even send an examination case to appeals unless there's more than 365 days left on this statute of limitations. And if they need more time, they might ask you to agree to extend this deadline.
Hold on, so if you don't agree to give them more time, they might just say, okay, never mind, we're not even going to hear your appeal. That seems, I don't know, a little intense.
It definitely adds another layer of strategy to the process. You have to weigh your options carefully, decide what's best for your situation. It's a good example of why having a tax professional in your corner can be so valuable.
Right. They can really help you navigate those tricky decisions.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say you've gone through this whole appeals process within the IRS. You've attended that conference, presented your case,
Right.
but you still haven't reached a settlement. What happens then? Game over.
Not at all. If you exhaust all your options within the IRS and you still can't agree with their findings, you can take your case to court.
Whoa, court. Now we're talking serious business. How often does that actually happen?
It's not as common as settling within the IRS, but it's definitely a possibility. And there are actually 3 different courts where your case could end up.
3.
3. The U.S. Tax Court, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, or your local U.S. District Court.
Okay, 3 different courts. Now I'm officially intimidated.
Yeah.
What are the key differences between these courts? How do you even know which one to choose?
That's where things get a little tricky, and why having professional legal advice at this stage is crucial. Each court has its own procedures, requirements, even quirks. For example, the U.S. Tax Court, it's often called a prepayment forum, meaning you can file a petition there before paying the full amount the IRS says you owe, but it's also more limited in the types of cases it can handle.
So it's like a trade-off, right? You might not have to pay up front, but your case might not even qualify for that court.
Exactly.
What about the other 2?
Both the U.S. Court of Federal Claims and your local U.S. District Court require you to pay the disputed amount in full and then file a claim for a refund. But the district court also has a residency requirement, meaning you need to live within that specific district to file your case there.
Okay, so choosing the right court is a strategic decision in itself. This is definitely starting to feel like a lot to juggle.
It can be.
Is there anything else about these court options that people should keep in mind?
One thing people often get wrong is thinking that once they file a petition with the tax court, they're locked into that path.
Yeah.
In reality, there's often an opportunity to go back and try to settle with appeals while your case is pending.
Wait, really? So even after you've taken that big step of going to court, there's still a chance to just negotiate and avoid that whole courtroom drama.
Absolutely. It's actually surprisingly common. The tax court will, keep your case moving along towards trial, but if you and appeals can hash things out beforehand, you might not even have to step foot in a courtroom. Win-win.
That's a huge relief to know. Just the thought of arguing my case in front of a judge gives me hives, to be honest.
I hear you. And settling through appeals can save you a lot of time, stress, and potentially even legal fees.
Speaking of legal fees,
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier the possibility of recovering some of the costs associated with this whole process. Can you break that down for me a little bit? What exactly can be recovered, and are there any catches?
So you might be able to get reimbursed for administrative and litigation costs, but only if you're considered the prevailing party.
Prevailing party sounds very, very legal.
It is.
What does that mean in plain English?
It basically means you win, or at least win enough to meet certain criteria. One way is to substantially prevail on the issue at hand, meaning the outcome is significantly in your favor. Another is to get a final judgment that's less than or equal to a qualified offer that the IRS previously rejected.
Okay, so it's not just about winning outright. It's about achieving a result that's significantly better than what the IRS initially offered.
Right.
What kind of costs can be recovered? Like, what are we talking about here?
Think attorney fees, court costs, administrative fees, even expenses for, expert witnesses or reports. But of course, there are some limitations and qualifications.
Of course, there are always limitations. What are some of the catches we should be aware of?
Well, the IRS sets a maximum hourly rate for attorney fees that can be recovered, and that rate changes every year. There are a few limited situations where you might be able to recover more than the maximum, but those are pretty rare.
Okay, so it's not a blank check, but it could definitely help offset some of those expenses.
Exactly. And it's a good reminder that open communication with your attorney is crucial throughout the process. Make sure you understand how fees work and what you might be able to recover.
Transparency is key. Now, we talked about the Taxpayer Advocate Service, or TAS, as a great resource for people who are struggling with these IRS issues. Can you tell me a little bit more about what kind of help they offer and how they actually make a difference for taxpayers?
TAS is a real champion for taxpayers. They're an independent organization within the IRS, and their whole mission is to protect your rights and make sure you're treated fairly.
Okay.
They can help with all sorts of issues, from resolving tax problems that are causing financial hardship to tackling systemic issues within the IRS itself.
That's amazing. So they're not just there to help, individuals navigate these specific cases, but also to advocate for improvements to the system as a whole.
Exactly. They're like a voice for the people within the IRS, working to make the agency more responsive and accountable to taxpayers.
I'm really curious. What are some specific situations where someone might want to reach out to TAS for help? What kind of problems do they typically handle?
So imagine you've been trying to resolve a tax issue with the IRS for months, maybe even years, and you're just hitting dead end after dead end.
Yeah.
You've called, you've written letters, but nothing seems to be working. TAS can step in and help you navigate that bureaucratic maze and hopefully get some answers.
So they're there for the people who are feeling lost and overwhelmed by the system.
Exactly. TAS understands that dealing with the IRS can be intimidating and confusing, and they're there to provide guidance and support, all for free.
Wow. Free help with these complex tax issues. No wonder they're so busy.
They are definitely in high demand, but they're committed to helping as many taxpayers as possible. They even have a national toll-free number and a website packed with information and resources.
Fantastic. We'll be sure to include all those details in our show notes for this episode. You mentioned earlier that TS can also tackle systemic issues within the IRS.
Right.
What does that actually look like in practice? Can you give me a real-world example?
Sure. Let's say there's a specific IRS form or procedure that's consistently causing confusion and headaches for taxpayers. Maybe the language is unclear or the steps are overly complicated. TS can investigate the issue, gather feedback from taxpayers and tax professionals, and then recommend changes to the IRS.
Okay.
They might suggest clarifying the wording on the form, streamlining the process, or even creating new resources to help taxpayers understand their rights and obligations.
So they're not just putting out fires, they're working to prevent them in the first place. That's a really proactive approach.
Absolutely. They have a big picture perspective and are always looking for ways to make the IRS more taxpayer friendly.
That's so encouraging to hear. It sounds like TTA plays a really important role in ensuring fairness and accountability within, the tax system as a whole.
They absolutely do. They're a crucial resource for taxpayers and a strong advocate for positive change within the IRS.
Now, I'm also curious about that other watchdog organization that we touched on briefly. TTT, the group that handles reports of misconduct by IRS employees.
Right.
Can you walk me through how that process works? What can someone do if they believe that an IRS employee has, acted unethically or abused their power?
So TTTA is an independent agency within the Treasury Department, and their whole focus is on investigating allegations of wrongdoing by IRS employees. We're talking about serious stuff like fraud, abuse, theft, even just unprofessional conduct that undermines public trust.
So it's a way to hold IRS employees accountable for their actions.
Precisely. TGT takes these allegations very seriously. They have a hotline and a website where you can report misconduct, and you can even choose to remain anonymous if you prefer.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
What happens after someone submits a report? Does TGT automatically launch a full investigation?
Not necessarily. They'll review the information you provide and determine if it warrants further action. If they decide to investigate, they'll gather evidence, interview witnesses, and ultimately issue a report with their findings.
So there's a process for, vetting these allegations and determining whether they have merit. What kind of outcomes can result from a TGT investigation? What happens if they find that an IRS employee actually did something wrong?
Well, the consequences depend on the severity of the misconduct. If they uncover evidence of serious wrongdoing, like a violation of the law, they can recommend criminal prosecution.
Okay.
But they can also recommend administrative actions, like disciplinary measures or even termination.
So there are real consequences for IRS employees who abuse their power or engage in unethical behavior.
Absolutely. TGT plays a vital role in maintaining the integrity of the IRS and ensuring public trust in the tax system.
That's reassuring to know. It's easy to feel powerless when you're dealing with this large government agency like the IRS.
Sure.
But it's good to know that there are these mechanisms in place to address misconduct and hold people accountable.
Yeah, you're not alone.
This has been a truly enlightening deep dive into the world of IRS appeals.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful for your insights. We've covered a ton of ground, but I can already tell this is a topic that could keep us talking for hours.
Oh, for sure. It's a complex area with a lot of nuances.
Yeah.
And just when you think you've got it all figured out, some new rule or regulation pops up.
That's the beauty of the tax code, right?
Yeah.
Always keeping us on our toes. But before we move on, I want to emphasize something we've touched on throughout this conversation.
Yeah.
The importance of seeking expert advice if you ever find yourself facing a tax dispute.
I couldn't agree more. Navigating the appeals process can be incredibly challenging, and having a knowledgeable professional in your corner can make all the difference. They can help you understand your rights, gather the right evidence, build a strong case, and represent you effectively during any hearings or conferences.
It's not something you have to or should try to handle alone.
Right. And remember those low-income taxpayer clinics we talked about? They're a great option for free or low-cost assistance if you qualify.
Don't hesitate to reach out for help if you need it. There's no shame in asking for guidance, especially when it comes to something as complex as taxes.
You're absolutely right. You're not alone in this, and there are people who can help guide you through the process.
All right, before we wrap up part one of this deep dive, I want to leave our listener with something to ponder.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about, individual rights and navigating these disputes with the IRS, but what about the bigger picture?
Right.
What systemic changes could be made to make the appeals process more accessible, transparent, and fair for all taxpayers?
Wow, that's a great question. And it's one that sparks a much larger conversation about ensuring equal access to justice when it comes to tax matters.
Exactly. We've been focusing on, the individual's journey through the appeals process.
Right.
But what about the system itself? How can we make it work better for everyone, regardless of their income, resources, or the complexity of their case?
I love that we're zooming out to look at the system as a whole. It's all about creating a tax system that truly serves and protects all taxpayers, not just a select few.
Well said. Let's take a quick break to gather our thoughts, and when we come back in part two, we'll continue our deep dive into the IRS appeals process,
Okay.
exploring some specific scenarios and those valuable resources in more detail.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, it really is fascinating how this whole appeals process intersects with, those broader issues of fairness and access to justice. It's a good reminder that we're not just talking about abstract legal concepts here, right? We're talking about real people.
Real people.
And their hard-earned money.
Yeah, exactly. It's so easy to get lost in the weeds of the forms and the deadlines and all that, but ultimately, this is about ensuring that everybody has a fair shot at resolving these disputes with the IRS, no matter, their background or their resources.
Absolutely. Well said. Now, before we stray too far from the practicalities of the appeals process, there's one thing I want to circle back to that we touched on earlier.
Okay.
Providing new information during the process.
Right.
You mentioned that, bringing up brand new issues or evidence that the IRS hasn't seen before, that can potentially cause delays.
Right. It's like trying to, introduce a surprise witness at the last minute during a trial.
Exactly. The appeals office, their focus is on reviewing the information and arguments that were already presented during the initial stages of your case. If you suddenly introduce something entirely new, they'll likely have to send it back to the original IRS team for further review, and that can add weeks, even months, to the process.
So it really pays to be thorough and upfront from the very beginning. Don't hold anything back.
Transparency is key. Make sure you've shared all the relevant information and documentation right from the start. It'll save you a lot of headaches down the line.
Now, we talked about the option of going to court if you can't reach a settlement through the IRS appeals process. But is that like a one-way door? Is there ever a chance to go back to appeals even after you've filed a petition with the tax court?
You'd be surprised how many people think that, filing with the tax court means burning all bridges with the IRS. But that's a misconception. In many cases, you still have the opportunity to settle with appeals even while your case is pending.
Wait, really? So you could potentially avoid that whole courtroom drama even after you've taken that step of filing a lawsuit?
Absolutely. In fact, it's often encouraged. The tax court will continue to follow its procedures and schedule your case for trial. But if you can hammer out an agreement with appeals in the meantime, you might not even have to go to court at all.
That's a huge relief to know.
It is.
And I imagine it could save everyone involved a lot of time, stress, and money.
You're right on all counts. Settling through appeals is generally the most efficient and cost-effective way to resolve these disputes.
Speaking of cost-effective, we talked about the possibility of recovering some legal fees. But are there limitations on that? What about the costs associated with, hiring a professional to represent you throughout this whole process? Can those be recouped?
That's where it gets a little more complicated. While you might be able to recover some attorney fees as part of your overall litigation costs, the IRS isn't exactly known for its generosity in this department.
So there are some hoops to jump through.
For sure. The IRS sets a maximum hourly rate for attorney fees that can be recovered, and it actually changes every year. There are a few very specific situations where you might be able to exceed that maximum rate, but those are rare exceptions.
So it's crucial to have a clear understanding of those limitations up front and discuss them, frankly, with your attorney.
Couldn't agree more. Transparency and open communication are essential throughout this entire process, especially when it comes to fees and potential reimbursements.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and delve a little deeper into the resources that are available to taxpayers, especially those who might be feeling, overwhelmed or lost in the system. We talked about the Taxpayer Advocate Service, or TAS, as a kind of like a guardian angel for taxpayers.
Right.
Can you paint a clearer picture of what kind of help they actually provide?
TAS is truly an invaluable resource. And remember, they're an independent organization within the IRS, which is pretty unique. Their primary goal is to protect your rights as a taxpayer and ensure that you're treated fairly throughout your interactions with the IRS. They can step in and help with a wide range of issues, from resolving those really frustrating tax problems that are causing financial hardship to addressing, even systemic issues within the IRS itself.
So they're not just putting out, individual fires, they're also working to prevent those fires from happening in the first place.
You got it. They're constantly advocating for improvements to processes and procedures within the IRS to make things, smoother and fairer for everyone.
What are some, real-life examples of situations where TS has made a difference? What kind of cases do they typically handle?
Imagine this. You've been trying to resolve a tax issue with the IRS for what feels like forever. You've called multiple times, sent letters, maybe even tried working with different IRS departments, but you're hitting a brick wall every time. You're starting to feel like you're banging your head against a wall.
Oh, yeah.
That's exactly when TS can step in and become your advocate. They have the authority to work directly with IRS personnel to try and untangle those bureaucratic knots and get you the answers you deserve.
So they're like the ultimate problem solvers within the IRS.
Exactly. They can also be a lifeline if you're facing a tax debt that you simply can't afford to pay. They might be able to help you negotiate a payment plan, explore an offer in compromise, or even get certain penalties waived if your situation warrants it.
Wow, it sounds like they really do have the power to make a difference in people's lives.
Absolutely. And the best part, their services are completely free. They're funded by Congress to ensure that taxpayers have access to impartial assistance, regardless of their income or ability to pay for professional representation.
That's incredible. It really underscores their commitment to fairness and accessibility. I'm betting they stay pretty busy, though, with so many people facing tax challenges these days.
Oh, they are, but they're committed to helping as many taxpayers as possible. They have a national toll-free number that you can call to get started, and their website is a treasure trove of information and resources. You can find guides, FAQs, and even links to local TS offices across the country.
That's so valuable. We'll definitely include all that contact information in our show notes. Now, you mentioned that TS can also address those like broader systemic issues within the IRS. Can you give me a real-world example of how they've done that?
Sure. Let's say TS starts noticing a pattern of complaints from taxpayers about a particular IRS form. Maybe it's incredibly confusing, or maybe the instructions are outdated or contradictory. TS can take a deep dive into the issue, analyze the feedback they're receiving, and then recommend changes to the IRS. They might suggest simplifying the language, clarifying the instructions, or even completely redesigning the form to make it more user-friendly.
So they're not just reacting to problems. They're also being proactive in identifying patterns and advocating for improvements that benefit everyone.
Exactly. They're constantly looking for ways to make the IRS more efficient, responsive, and accountable to the taxpayers it serves.
That's really encouraging to hear. It sounds like TS plays a vital role in kind of balancing the scales of power and ensuring that taxpayers have a fighting chance when they're dealing with the complexities of, the tax system.
I couldn't agree more. They're truly champions for taxpayers' rights, and their work makes a huge difference in making the system fairer and more equitable for everyone.
Now, let's pivot back to that other watchdog organization that we discussed, TGT, which investigates allegations of misconduct by IRS employees.
Right.
What are some scenarios where someone might want to reach out to TGT? What kind of behavior warrants a report to this agency?
So TGT is there to address those serious breaches of trust that erode public confidence in the IRS. We're talking about allegations of outright criminal activity, like fraud, theft, or extortion by an IRS employee.
So if you suspect that an IRS employee is, lining their own pockets or using their position for personal gain, TGT is the agency to contact.
Exactly. But it's not just about financial crimes. TGT also investigates allegations of abuse of power, like if an IRS employee is using their authority to harass or intimidate taxpayers.
That's really important. It's about ensuring that IRS employees are held to the highest ethical standards and that taxpayers have a safe and reliable channel for reporting any kind of misconduct.
Precisely. TG takes these allegations seriously, and they have a robust process for investigating them thoroughly and fairly.
Can you walk me through that process a little bit? What happens after someone submits a report to TGTA? Do they automatically launch like a full-blown investigation based on every single report?
Not necessarily. They have a team of professionals who carefully review each report and determine whether there's enough information to warrant further action. They're looking for, credible allegations supported by evidence, not just hearsay or vague suspicions.
So it's not about launching witch hunts. It's about ensuring that these allegations are properly vetted before taking any further steps.
Exactly. If TGT decides to investigate, they have a whole arsenal of tools at their disposal. They can conduct interviews, subpoena documents, and even work with law enforcement agencies if necessary.
It sounds like they have the authority and the resources to conduct really thorough investigations. What happens if they find that an IRS employee has actually engaged in misconduct? What are the potential consequences?
It really depends on the severity of the misconduct. If they uncover evidence of criminal activity, they can refer the case to the Department of Justice for potential prosecution.
So there's a possibility of, jail time for IRS employees who break the law.
Absolutely. But even if the misconduct doesn't rise to the level of criminal charges, TGT can still recommend a range of administrative actions, from disciplinary measures and reprimands to suspension or even termination.
So there are consequences, even for those gray areas of misconduct that might not be, illegal, but are still unethical or damaging to public trust.
Exactly. TGT plays a crucial role in maintaining the integrity of the IRS and ensuring that taxpayers have confidence in the system. Knowing that there's an independent watchdog agency keeping an eye on things can go a long way in restoring faith in the process.
That's so reassuring. It's a powerful reminder that even within, a large and complex bureaucracy like the IRS, there are mechanisms in place to hold people accountable and protect taxpayers' rights. This has been an incredible journey so far, and I'm feeling much more informed about the nuances of the IRS appeals process. But there's one thing that keeps nagging at me. We've talked a lot about those formal appeals processes, the small case requests, the written protests, even the possibility of going to court. But are there times when those formal processes might not even be necessary?
That's a great question. And it's one that highlights the importance of, exploring all your options before jumping into the deep end of the appeals process. Sometimes a simpler solution might be right at your fingertips.
Okay, you've officially piqued my curiosity. What are some of those alternative approaches that taxpayers should consider before filing a formal appeal?
Well, remember how we talked about the importance of communicating directly with the IRS employee handling your case?
Yeah.
Sometimes a simple phone call or a well-crafted letter can clear up misunderstandings and resolve issues without ever needing to file a formal appeal.
So it's always worth trying to work things out informally first before resorting to those, more complex processes.
Exactly. And here's another option that many people overlook. The IRS has something called penalty abatement, which allows them to, waive or reduce certain penalties under certain circumstances.
Wait, hold on. They can just forgive penalties. That sounds too good to be true.
It's not a free pass, of course. There are specific criteria you need to meet to qualify for penalty abatement. But if you have a legitimate reason for failing to file on time or pay your taxes in full, it's definitely worth exploring.
What are some of those, legitimate reasons that might qualify for penalty abatement?
Well, they often take into account things like unavoidable circumstances, like a serious illness or natural disaster. They also consider whether you have a history of complying with tax laws and whether you've made a good faith effort to rectify the situation.
So it's not just about having a sob story. It's about demonstrating that you're taking responsibility and trying to do the right thing.
Precisely. And remember, if you're not sure whether you qualify for penalty abatement, you can always reach out to TAS for guidance. They're experts in navigating these waters and can help you determine the best course of action.
TAS really is a lifesaver.
They are.
So, to sum up, before diving headfirst into that formal appeals process, it's always worth exploring those informal options first. Talk to the IRS employee handling your case. See if you can work things out through open communication, and definitely inquire about penalty abatement if you think you might qualify.
Well said. It's all about being informed, proactive, and knowing all your options. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one.
Okay, I'm feeling much more empowered now. But before we move on to part 3 of this deep dive, I want to address something that's probably on our listeners' mind.
Emma, all ears.
We've talked a lot about the potential costs associated with this appeals process, legal fees, court costs, and the like. But what about the emotional toll? This whole process can be incredibly stressful and anxiety-inducing, especially for those who are already facing financial hardship.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the technicalities and the legalities.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about the human side of this equation. Dealing with the IRS can be emotionally draining, even for those who are, well-versed in the tax code.
Exactly. So what are some strategies for managing that stress and anxiety? How can people protect their mental and emotional well-being while they're navigating this often daunting process?
That's such an important question, and it's one that deserves more attention. First and foremost, remember that you're not alone in this. Millions of people face tax issues every year, and there are resources available to help you cope with the emotional burden.
Right. We've talked about TAS, but are there other organizations that provide emotional support or counseling specifically for taxpayers?
There are. Many local communities have financial counseling services that can provide guidance and support, and there are even online forums and support groups where you can connect with others who are going through similar experiences.
That sense of community can be so powerful. Just knowing that you're not alone and that others have successfully navigated, similar challenges can make a world of difference.
Absolutely. Another crucial strategy is to, prioritize self-care throughout the process. Make sure you're getting enough sleep, eating healthy foods, and engaging in activities that bring you joy and relaxation. It's easy to let the stress consume you, but taking care of yourself is essential for staying resilient and making sound decisions.
It's like that oxygen mask on an airplane,
Uh-huh.
You have to take care of yourself first before you can effectively help others.
That's a great analogy. And remember, don't be afraid to ask for help. Whether it's from a tax professional, a financial counselor, a friend, or a family member, having a support system in place can make all the difference in navigating this challenging journey.
Wise words. And on that note, let's take a quick break to gather our thoughts and recharge. When we return in part 3, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the IRS appeals process with some final thoughts, key takeaways, and some empowering advice for facing those tax challenges head on. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've really been on quite a journey here, exploring the ins and outs of the IRS appeals process, those watchdog organizations that help to keep things in check, and even, the emotional roller coaster that can sometimes come with these tax disputes. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling a lot more knowledgeable and a lot less intimidated by the whole thing now.
Yeah, me too. It really is amazing how just a little bit of knowledge can shift your perspective
It really is.
and empower you to kind of take control of these situations that maybe used to seem so overwhelming.
Right. It's like having that secret decoder ring for the tax code.
Uh-huh.
Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to, distill some of the key takeaways here, those golden nuggets of wisdom that our listener can walk away with.
Golden nuggets it is. Okay, so let's start with, I think, the most important one. You have rights as a taxpayer.
Yes.
Don't ever forget that. If you disagree with something the IRS says, don't just, roll over and accept it. You have options, you have a voice, and you have the right to appeal.
And remember, appealing isn't about, being confrontational or like declaring war on the IRS or anything.
No.
It's about ensuring a fair and impartial review of your case.
Yeah.
It's about making sure that your side of the story is heard.
Right. We talked about all those different types of appeals, from that streamlined small case request for those smaller disputes under $25,000
Right.
to the more formal written protest for the bigger ticket issues.
Right.
Knowing which path to take is crucial.
Yeah. And then there's that whole concept of the statute of limitations.
Right.
Which I still find pretty mind-blowing, honestly. The IRS has deadlines, too.
They do.
It's not a free-for-all. They can just keep coming after you indefinitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a good reminder that time is of the essence in these matters. Don't miss deadlines for filing your appeal or responding to IRS requests,
Right.
It could seriously jeopardize your case.
We also explored the possibility of taking your case to court if you just can't reach a settlement within the IRS.
Yeah.
And those 3 different courts, each with their own kind of quirks and procedures.
Right. And, if you find yourself at that stage, having that tax professional by your side is invaluable. They can really help you navigate those legal complexities and make sure you're not going it alone.
And let's not forget about those, amazing resources that are available to taxpayers, often for free. The Taxpayer Advocate Service, or TAS, is like a guardian angel for anyone struggling with tax issues. They can help you resolve problems, advocate for your rights, and even tackle those systemic issues within the IRS that might be causing, widespread headaches.
Yeah, TDS is truly a remarkable organization. And then there's TALGT, that watchdog that keeps IRS employees in check. If you believe an IRS employee has acted unethically or abused their power, TDA is there to investigate those allegations and hold those individuals accountable.
Don't ever hesitate to reach out to these resources if you need help. They exist to support and protect taxpayers. Now, I want to circle back to something we discussed earlier that I think is really important. It's the emotional toll that all of this can take.
Yeah.
Dealing with the IRS, especially when you're facing a dispute, it can be incredibly stressful and anxiety-inducing.
Oh, absolutely. We can't overlook the human side of this, right? It's not just about numbers and deadlines. It's about real people facing real challenges.
It's real people.
And trying to navigate a complex system.
Exactly. So how can our listener protect their mental and emotional well-being, while they're going through this process? What are some strategies for managing that stress and staying resilient?
Well, first and foremost, remember that you're not alone in this. Millions of people face tax issues every year, and there are support systems in place to help you cope.
Right. We talked about TAS, but what about those, local financial counseling services or even online forums and support groups where you can connect with others who are going through similar experiences?
Those can be incredibly valuable. Sometimes just talking to someone who, understands what you're going through can make a world of difference.
It really can.
And remember, self-care is crucial during these times of stress.
Oh, yeah.
Make sure you're prioritizing things like sleep, healthy eating, and engaging in activities that, bring you joy, help you de-stress.
Right. It's so easy to let the stress consume you and neglect those basic needs. But taking care of yourself is not a luxury. It's essential for staying grounded and making clear-headed decisions.
Couldn't agree more. And finally, don't be afraid to ask for help. Whether it's from a tax professional, a financial counselor, a therapist, or even, a trusted friend or family member.
Wow.
Having a support system in place can make this whole process a lot less daunting.
That's such a powerful message. You are not alone. There are people who care and want to help.
Yeah.
Now, before we sign off, I want to leave our listener with one final thought, something to kind of chew on as they continue their exploration of the tax world. We've been focusing on the individual's journey through the appeals process, those resources available, and even that emotional side of things.
Right.
But what about the bigger picture?
Yeah.
What systemic changes could be made to make this whole process more accessible, transparent, and user-friendly for all taxpayers?
Wow, those are some big questions.
Yeah.
And, they're the kind of questions that spark those really important conversations about how we can create, a fairer and more equitable tax system for everyone.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond just those individual struggles and thinking about how we can make the system itself work better for all of us.
I love how you've brought us full circle here from those nitty-gritty details of appeals
Right.
to this broader vision of a more just and equitable tax system. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of how we, collect and distribute resources in our society.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the IRS appeals process. I hope our listener feels, empowered, informed, and maybe even a little bit inspired to take action, whether it's tackling their own tax challenges or advocating for those systemic changes that could make a difference for everyone.
It's been an amazing journey. And remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to navigating the complexities of the tax world.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Keep those brains buzzing, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into a topic that matters.